everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Climate of Sport Ask Me Anything podcast. It's a pleasure to be back with you, and thank you for your ongoing support of the podcast and sharing it and rating it and reviewing it. It's all so appreciated. If you haven't done that already, please scroll down and give it a review if you have time. It all helps raise awareness, and as a small organisation, getting this great word out to as many people as possible. So thank you all for your ongoing support, and thank you for your ongoing questions. So we're still in the Ask Me Anything series. There's still a lot of questions coming in for the next few weeks, but keep them coming in as well. We will carry on doing this for as long as there is questions being asked. So if you have anything on your mind and you haven't managed to send us an email or drop us a note on social media, please make sure you do that. We love to hear from you. So this week, the question has come via email by someone who would like to be kept anonymous. And they've asked, how do you invest in sustainability in temporary events? So this week, that's what we're going to be covering. I will caveat this, that this is not going to be an exhaustive run through. So this should not be taken as a blueprint for everything. But what we want to do through the podcast is raise awareness of how you may begin to start looking at this. But of course, there's a lot of resources online that we can direct you to, and a lot of credible individuals and organizations that would be able to help you more specifically with this. By temporary events, this episode, we're talking about sports that don't take place in a permanent venue, but obviously they could manifest in many different ways. So it might be a competition that moves around the world. It could be a touring event that's going into new places. It might be an outdoor event. So there isn't a permanent structure, but maybe it takes place every few months or every year in an outdoor space, or mass participation events. Obviously, they set up a huge sporting event happens and then they disappear in cities. So we're not, for the purpose of this podcast, looking at temporary events that are mega sports events that in many ways are, of course, temporary events as well. A lot of mega sport events use some permanent and some temporary structures, but based on the spirit of the podcast and this question, we're coming at it more from perhaps grassroots sport or ongoing professional sport of a smallish size in terms of getting started on this and getting going. So that's the lens that we're going to look at it this week. And again, the caveat, this is not going to be an exhaustive, it's not a blueprint. It's just raising awareness of some of the key themes that you want to be thinking about if you are hosting a temporary sport event, but are looking to invest in sustainability. So the start of this is obviously to underline that whether your sporting event is temporary or permanent, sustainability should sit at the heart of everything you do. So just because your event is only taking place for 2 days in 1 year doesn't mean that you can abscond the responsibility of sustainability because it's not, you don't have a permanent venue, etc. You want to obviously be ensuring that you put sustainability at the heart of everything you do. Actually, temporary events could be seen as having a larger impact on the environment because a lot of the temporary infrastructure, depending on how you go about it, there could be a huge amount of waste from temporary events compared to events that take place in permanent venues that would have a much larger footprint to start off with, but have a much longer life. So that's the way we want to think about it. So first of all, starting off with the fact that sustainability is, of course, as important for temporary sport events as it is for those in permanent structure. Where to start with this? As with everything, if you are thinking about your temporary sport event and how you get going with sustainability, the first most logical step is for you to think about an inventory of everything you need for the event. It's always a great place to start to think, whether it's a first time event or whether it's been running for 25 years, but you're just starting to think about this. The collection of data is always the cornerstone of all of this work. So an inventory of what you need, an inventory on, if you have from previous events, the sorts of levels of materials, products, services that you would expect to need is a great place to start mapping out what you need and also potentially where the impacts, the environmental impacts might land for you. So a great place to start. And then my first point in terms of putting sustainability at the heart of your temporary event after you've thought about the overall inventory is obviously thinking about the operational impact first of all and trying to think that through the frame of circularity. So again, when you're thinking about reducing your operational impact, you've done the inventory of everything you need for the event. The starting point obviously is procurement. So when you're procuring goods and services for temporary events, the easiest way that you can start reducing that impact is working with your suppliers and your partners to help you on that journey to ensure sustainability is weaved into your procurement policy, into your tenders, and into questions for suppliers. So if you can start from there at a ground floor level, it means that you're not having to retrospectively reduce the impact of things. You're starting from a really good place. And when we're talking about procuring goods and services, a few of those key areas are, for example, infrastructure. So if you are having a temporary sport event, the likelihood is in some ways you're going to need some infrastructure. Maybe it is staff offices, maybe it is stands and bleachers for spectators, maybe it is hoardings to make sure the particular sporting event is away from the spectators from a health and safety perspective. The likelihood is you're going to be investing in a lot of temporary infrastructure to make your sporting event happen. Think about there, what do you need to buy and what do you need to rent? The rental market can provide a huge amount of reusable temporary infrastructure, and obviously that will immediately reduce your impact on the environment. If you do have to build anything, think about how you can do it sustainably. Think about where it will end up after the event, how it could be repurposed, how it could be reused, how it could be not a single-use building or a single-use piece of infrastructure just for your event. The common sense approach in terms of infrastructure. Temporary sports events, because of the nature of them, tend to have a lot of waste. So we think about waste a lot of the time in terms of spectators and fans creating food and packaging waste potentially at sports events. But obviously for temporary sports events where there is perhaps the creation of a lot of single-use signage, there's a lot of infrastructure that could go to waste. There's a lot of elements of that could end up being very, very wasteful. So the waste management part of your effort for your temporary sport event is really important. Harold Friedel from Circular Leadership is someone I've known and followed for a long time. And while we think of the 3 R's around reduce, reuse, recycle, he's actually extended that out to 10 R's, which I think is really interesting just to highlight, to show that if we are thinking from a true waste management and circularity lens, it goes far beyond reduce, reuse, recycle and into, number 1, reconnect, number 2, refuse, number 3, rethink. Then number 4 and 5 are reduce and reuse. But after that, repair, refurbish, remanufacture, repurpose, and then finally recycle and recover. So again, I think when we are looking through the lens of temporary sport events and that circularity lens, we're at a stage now where we are much further beyond where we were. And we have to be thinking much more holistically about what we're using, not just that it perhaps is a recycled product or that it potentially could be reused, but also where it's going to end up in its end of life. So there's no point in trying to reuse materials that perhaps will only be used once more and then end up in landfill, or can be used a number of times, but then will end up being downcycled into something else. These are great ways that we can ensure it's not a single use, but of course, asking the right questions about how any materials that you purpose that are single use can be reduced, reused, repaired, refurbished, remanufactured, repurposed, and then recycled or recovered is very, very important. So lots of information available on that too. I mentioned signage there, and I extend that from signage into merchandise as well. Signage for individual events, of course, can end up creating a lot of waste, especially if, because of your event, perhaps, of course, the year changes. Maybe it takes place once a year. So if you have signage that has the year on it, that immediately makes it single use. If your sponsors and partners change every year, that again can make it single use when you go back to reusing it the following year. So think about what you need, think about how it could be reused, stored and reused for the future, and try and think logically as well in terms of the amount of signage you need and how you can separate it out. So maybe you can reinforce your own brand as the name of the sporting event without the year on some of your signage, and then on other signage that you know is going to be more single use and you have to be more thoughtful about it, try and make sure all of that signage has the year and your partners on, but is kept separate to perhaps some of signage that you could use year on year, which is the name of the event, but not with the year associated. So it's not all or nothing. How can we try and reduce by being thoughtful about these things? And that's actually something we do with Sport Positive Summit. We try and reduce the amount of signage we need. We make sure it's got a good end of life. either being recycled or downcycled. We look at, because we're an indoor temporary event, we look at digital signage and screens and the use of gobos in terms of putting your brand into a light and projecting it onto a wall. All of these have a much smaller footprint than your traditional PVC or vinyl signage. So again, how can you be more thoughtful with that? Then as well, don't just think, well, I can reuse it. So what does that look like? Think about if the event moves year on year, what the emissions might be to store and transport it. So again, if it's a temporary event that is taking place this year in London and next year in Shanghai, immediately you might think, well, if I store and transport that to the next event, it's going to have a lower carbon footprint. But you need to understand what the carbon footprint is, because if it's a heavy amount of signage and has to be shipped by air, you might actually find that that's got a higher footprint than having it single use and having it repurposed in some ways. So again, don't just think you know the answer. Continually question what the impacts are going to be. Loads of organizations now repurpose, for example, banner materials into bags or accessories. And there's lots of ways that materials can be repurposed. But the main thing is that you're thinking thoughtfully about what you need, how you can achieve your goals with the lowest possible footprint, and how you can be thoughtful about that. The same with merchandise. How much merchandise do you need? Especially in mass participation events now, we're seeing a much more of a move to moving away from finisher t-shirts and into something digital or into a charitable donation or a tree planting scheme instead. A lot of the time now, entering races, there's a tick box if you wish to have a finisher t-shirt, and you can opt out and have that donated, as I've mentioned, to tree planting or to a charitable donation, etc. So again, don't just presume that you need to create all of the merch. Be thoughtful about what you need and how you can reduce the impact there. Power and water are the last ones I'll mention here. Depending on the length of your event, you may need lighting as well as energy. So wherever your event's situated, think again, can you use grid connections instead of temporary power like generators? And if you can, try and find out if that mains connection is powered by renewable energy or fossil. Collecting all of that data and understanding it will give you a really good view as to what your impact is. If you have to go for temporary power, either as a primary power source or as a redundancy, where things like generators, look at alternatives such as biofuels, solar hybrid, hydrogen, etc. There's other generators now that are available that would have a lower impact than just having your traditional diesel generator. And if it is a longer event and you think it's much more complex than that, think about working with specialists to design something more energy efficient around power, lighting. In different parts of the world, you may be looking at cooling stations, which can be very energy intensive. So again, if you think it's quite complex and there's a lot of changes that you need, try and see if you can work with specialists or consultants to design something more energy efficient overall. And the last one, water, in the same way, where possible, if you can get mains water supplies for drinking water and sanitation, that of course is going to have a lower impact than transporting in temporary infrastructure. If temporary infrastructure is required, again, think about who your supplier is to that. Can you try and find someone who can do that locally to reduce those transport miles? Can you look at other events that are happening and try and co-locate to make that more efficient? Or can you bring in a hydration or water partner? Again, as we think about procurement and suppliers and sponsors and brands, could you work with a hydration or water partner to support you on this through the sustainability lens? So not exhaustive there. There is so much. I mean, we could do hours on reducing the operational impact of your temporary sport event, but just some top line to think about, and loads of resources available online about this, which I'll reference at the end. And we'll also put in the show notes for you to look at more closely. So the first one on my list was reducing operational impact and trying to think in a circular way around your goods and services and your operational impact. The next stage of this is thinking about engaging your whole value chain. So when it comes to sustainability, yes, of course, it's very important for someone to be in charge and lead on this to make sure that everything happens in a timely way and it's as efficient as possible. But it really is everybody's responsibility. So start with staff, obviously, whoever's on your full-time or your ongoing support team in terms of staff, and bring them in about their ideas, bring them in on how they think we can reduce. They're going to be crucial for you collecting the data that you need in terms of what your inventory is, what happens for the event, when it happens, who you work with. Perhaps also if you've got historic suppliers that you need to begin conversations with and changing the dynamic a bit. Often, of course, conversations with suppliers start from a financial price point, and that might be who you've worked with for a long time because that made sense. Now that you're bringing in sustainability to sit at the heart of your temporary sport event, the conversation, the dynamic might be different, where, of course, there is a financial impetus, but also it's important to understand their commitments to sustainability and how they can help you reach your goals. So bringing your staff in at the start of that, very important. Suppliers, as we've mentioned, having a sustainable procurement policy in place to ensure that you're working with suppliers of products and services that match your sustainability agenda is, for me, one of the most unsung heroes of the way sport can reduce its impact, because the sport industry procures and creates so much that if that can be done by working with suppliers that match your goals, essentially they go from being suppliers into your partners in terms of reaching these goals, because they have the expertise and you can work with the experts who have perhaps the technology, the innovation, and the efficiencies that you need to create for your temporary sport event. Procurement, an absolute unsung hero of this effort and something we need to focus on a lot more. Make sure, again, if you haven't got that sustainable procurement policy, there are some available online. There's others that we can direct you to, again, in the show notes to get a start on that. There's a lot of championships that have taken place that have done great procurement policies that are available in the public domain. If you don't know where to start with that, just reach out and we can help direct on that. But that really is, again, in terms of engaging organizations and working collaboratively to reduce your impact, that tenders procurement process is really, really important. In the same vein, sponsors and brands. Think about how your sponsors, brands, whether it's their brand, whether it's their investment, whether it's their alignment or their reach, how can that help you with your sustainability agenda? Who are your sponsors? Do they still align with your goals as you try and reduce your impact on the environment? Or do you need to start looking at new sponsors? Can you bring sponsors and brands along with you on this journey? Share what you're looking to achieve, help them to understand what goals you're looking to achieve, and tap into their knowledge, their expertise, their reach to say, can you help with this? How could this work? What can we do that's something special and different? There are a lot of now athletes that are highly activated in this space. Maybe they're competing in your temporary sport event. Maybe they are in the sport globally. How can they help you raise awareness of this and perhaps get to the right sponsors, get to the right suppliers, help amplify the work that you're doing? Bringing athletes in along the journey could be a really, really helpful way for you to start moving on this, even at a grassroots level. Grassroots all the way up to professional, athletes really are the voice of the industry. So think about how that can work for you. If it is a temporary sport event that's broadcast, many broadcasters now themselves have incredibly high sustainability policies. Understand what they're doing, understand how you can collaborate to help the footprint down. Try and ask them what they need. There might be some very obvious connections there in terms of power, water, sanitation, health and safety, security, branding, signage that they've got great ideas on that can help you as well. So try and make that work collaboratively with broadcasters. And last but not least, volunteers. The majority of temporary sport events are heavily reliant on volunteers or stewards to make them happen. How are you working with them? They're the face of the event. Can you help them receive training? Can you bring them on earlier in the process to get their input on how they can help with the sustainability efforts? And again, how can we leverage and work with volunteers to collect data, make sustainability part of everyone's role, connect the dots? As I said, where possible, providing that education and training can have a massive ripple effect. The volunteers at your temporary sport event probably do that at other sport events, and they can take those learnings with them into their community, into their businesses, into their family and friends, etc. So there's some other ways that you can engage with the whole value chain when you're thinking about sustainability for your temporary sport event. The next one is attendee and participant travel. So we hear time and time again that the biggest footprint of sport is fan and participant travel. And whether your sporting event is at a venue or whether it is taking place as a one-off or yearly event in a temporary scenario, the same applies. You are still going to have fans and participants traveling to your event, probably in high numbers, depending on the size of the event. So again, it doesn't matter that your event's temporary, that carbon footprint is going to be the same as a venue-based partner. If you can site your temporary sport event with good public transport and connections, then of course, that's absolutely the best. If you can't, perhaps it is a more rural temporary sporting event, then think again, just the same as with venue-based sport? Can you support carpooling or low carbon option? Can you try and reduce the journey? Park and ride, liaising with local bus companies or coach companies or rail to try and provide options to at least reduce some of the carbon footprint of those journeys, and communicate with attendees to have them travel as sustainably as possible and work out what the best options are available for that. The last point I mentioned, because I haven't mentioned it already, is the importance of data through all of this. The same for all sporting events. Try and collect as much data as you can in terms of your full carbon footprint, to understand it, to be able to get a good hold on it for future years or future temporary events, and to understand what your overall impact is in case you are planning to remove or compensate for unavoidable emissions that are caused through the temporary event. Number 4 on my list is thinking about community and legacy. So this is important for all sporting events, obviously, but for temporary sport events where perhaps you are coming into a community, creating an infrastructure, perhaps impacting local travel and services, impacting a local community, really, really important to have that front of mind in terms of what impact you're having and what legacy that is causing. So no matter what size the one-off event is, you've probably got some kind of opportunity to create initiatives, ways of doing things, processes with suppliers, participants, partners, guests, and community to make sure that through all of these relationships that there is an understanding of community impact, and then obviously trying to work to reduce that and ensure a positive legacy. And you do have a shorter time frame, of course, with a temporary sport event to ensure that positive impact on the community, but maybe it's variable depending on how that works. But obviously you want to always try and leave behind, ensure an impact is positive. And that can manifest in lots of different ways. So I was speaking to Bob Ramsack at World Athletics recently about the Glasgow Indoor Championships in the UK, in Scotland, that took place recently, and he shared a lot about their efforts. And one that really stood out to me was community impact in Glasgow, where the indoor championships took place. One of those really interesting areas was a food bank. So there was too much food at the event, extra food being delivered to them very close to the arena, and this excess food was delivered and immediately distributed to where it needed to go. And actually, whilst also having a positive impact during the event, a legacy was created where for future events that take place at the arena, they will continue to do the same in terms of any excess food being donated to the local food bank and used within the community. So again, a great example there of legacy and community around a temporary sport event. So definitely that would manifest in many different ways depending where your event is taking place and the impact on the local community. That's a great example there of food. It might be something around transport or biodiversity or infrastructure. There's lots of different ways that could manifest, but certainly thinking community and legacy as part of your effort is absolutely crucial. Then the last one I will mention is just learning from others. Really, there's so many other organizations that are doing great work in this space outside of sport. So what immediately springs to mind for me around temporary events overall are music festivals. They often happen in very rural locations, popping up in a field for a few days or a week. A lot of temporary infrastructure, a lot of impact on the environment, and a lot of festival organisers have been working for a very long time about reducing that impact. The ones that spring to mind are Julie's Bicycle and Reverb, both that have a lot of resources online. So if you are a smaller or a grassroots event or even a medium-sized event, there's a lot of great content there that you can go to and look at about where you should start. And also, I mentioned World Athletics and Bob that I spoke to recently about this. Another great resource, which I'll link in the podcast notes, is the World Athletics Sustainable Event Management Best Practice Guidance. I'll share the link to that. Bob tells me that's available now in 16 languages, which is a fantastic resource. So many of the learnings within there can be applied to temporary sporting events. So many of the learnings can be applied to all events. So I recommend you look at that now. We always have an expert insight in on our pod. So now I'm going to pass over to Kate Chapman, who's the head of sustainability at London Marathon Events, to give her insight into how she puts sustainability at the heart of what they do. Not a temporary sport event in that, of course, the London Marathon is a very, very well-known annual event, but certainly temporary infrastructure to create a huge mass participation event in the centre of London. What are her tips? Kate, over to you.
So for temporary events, location is, I suppose, the first thing to talk about when we're thinking about sort of prioritizing sustainability. So having somewhere that is easily accessible in terms of public transport is obviously optimal. But clearly that does get more difficult often for temporary events, which can be taking place sort of way out in more remote areas. So it's not just actually how your audience or your participants are going to get to that event site. You've also got to think about all the vehicle movements, because for a temporary event, clearly everything is coming in for that event itself. So you're bringing in the toilets, you're bringing in the tents, you're bringing in the barriers, you're bringing in the signage, you're bringing in all the food and drink, the waste infrastructure. You're pretty much starting with a blank canvas. And so all of that is going to require vehicle movement. So if you've got a choice on location, then thinking about how to minimize the number of vehicle movements or the distance that people are having to travel is a really big consideration. I guess if you can't really influence the location, then the next thing to really think about is, okay, where are your suppliers based, and can you be sourcing from suppliers that are closer to where that event's taking place, again to minimize those vehicle movements, because we find we have a huge number of contractors and deliveries to our various sites, and we work really hard to choose suppliers that are going to minimize those miles, those lorry miles. And then because you're only going to be a temporary event, then hiring rather than buying clearly makes most sense, particularly for large bits of infrastructure. I mean, it would make no sense to be purchasing huge marquees and miles of barrier and toilets and that sort of thing. So there's clearly a well-established rental market. So yeah, prioritizing hiring over buying so that you're not left with lots of things to deal with at the end of the event is important. Power is another thing to think about. So you might be lucky at your temporary event and be able to plug into the grid. For most of the events that we run, even in London, it's extraordinarily difficult to plug into the grid. So we use a lot of temporary power in the form of generators, and increasingly now generators with batteries attached to those. All the generators that we use run on HVO, which is hydro-treated vegetable oil. It's got lower carbon emissions and far better for air quality, because there just aren't the particulates coming from it that diesel produces. But we've found that being able to use batteries alongside the generators means that we can drastically reduce the number of generators that we need, and also the amount of fuel that we're burning. And then you need to think about things like signage and branding. On a permanent venue, you've probably got all of that utility type signage around the place. So entrances and exits and muster points in case of emergencies, toilets and that sort of thing. But on a temporary event, you need an awful lot of that wayfinding signage. So things to consider there are making sure that it's undated, making sure that it's sort of as free from any sponsorship branding as you can possibly get away with, because then you can keep it and use it again across other events. And all of that branding and signage needs to be attached. And that's where the curse of the temporary event comes in, which is the plastic cable tie. It's so easy to get through thousands and thousands of these things. We've largely switched our events to using bungees to attach the fabric branding to barriers. With signage, it's a lot more difficult because you don't want people to easily be able to remove them. It does happen, particularly out on routes. Not everybody is thrilled to have a cycling event or a running event happening perhaps outside their front gate, and it's not unknown for people to move signage. So unfortunately, we're still having to use cable ties there. But there are alternatives, like I say, with these bungees, where perhaps it's not quite so critical for keeping signage in place. And then the other one that I would want to mention is around sort of direct impacts on nature. So lots of temporary events happen in parks, out, more out of the urban environment, and there can be impacts on nature in terms of if you've got lighting on overnight. Noise pollution is another thing, and then the sort of the trampling and the ground disturbance that can happen when you're bringing in large heavy vehicles on unpaved surfaces. So a lot of thought needs to go into, and a lot of preparation needs to go into sort of, well, okay, what's there? What features are there that you need to be really respectful of? Do you need to put trackway down before you bring vehicles onto a site? Being really careful, for example, to never park under the canopy of a tree because you damage the roots. You should be driving under trees anyway, because that's going to be, close underneath trees in case you damage them. And thinking about any disturbance to the sort of local to flora and fauna on that particular site. So again, we sort of work closely with, particularly with the Royal Parks on that, and we give a lot of advice out to our contractors and to our staff coming on and off site, and also think about kind of remediation afterwards. If there has been any ground damage, then how can we restore that afterwards? So yeah, those would be the main things, and I hope that's helpful.
And I think that was incredibly helpful. Thank you, Kate. Once again, that was Kate Chapman, who's head of sustainability at London Marathon Group. Loads of incredible insights there. I'm delighted that a lot of Kate's insights overlap a little bit with mine, but really, really important additions there, especially around some of the smaller things that maybe we don't immediately think about, like the cable ties. Obviously, the nature impacts is a great one. It's absolutely brilliant to have Kate's insight into this important topic as such a leader in this area and the way this manifests for mass participation events. So thanks a million again, Kate, for that. That's all from us for this episode. I hope this has been helpful for you. And thank you again for the anonymous question, which was about how to invest in sustainability in temporary sport events. Well, I hope you found it very useful. Once again, everything that's been highlighted, the resources we will link in the show notes if you want to look at anything further around that. Thank you for being with us this week, and we look forward to getting more of your questions, answering more of them, and bringing more expert insights to this podcast. We really appreciate your listening and sharing, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Climate of Sport Ask Me Anything. Don't forget, you could submit your question, any question at all about sport and sustainability, through our email address, which is hello@climateofsport.com. You can also submit your question through our website, www.sportpositive.org/podcast, or DM us on our social media pages, LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter or X. If you don't wish us to read out your name, please just write the word anonymous at the top of your message. If you enjoyed this week's episode and you'd like to get it every week, click follow on the podcast to get it directly into your playlist. And please do share, give a review, and comment on the social media coverage of this episode. It helps us share the message further. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.